Section 12 of A Little Tour in France by Henry James. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 30. There are two shabby old inns at Arles which compete closely for your custom. I mean by this that if you elect to go to the Hôtel du Forum, the Hôtel du Nord, which is placed exactly beside it at a right angle, watches your arrival with ill-concealed disapproval. And if you take the chances of its neighbour, the Hôtel du Forum seems to glare at you invidiously from all its windows and doors. I forget which of these establishments I selected. Whichever it was, I wished very much that it had been the other. The two stand together on the Place des Hommes, a little public square of Arles, which somehow quite misses its effect. As a city, indeed, Arles quite misses its effect in every way. And if it is a charming place, as I think it is, I can hardly tell the reason why. The straight-note Arlésiennes account for it in some degree, and the remainder may be charged to the ruins of the arena and the theatre. Beyond this, I remember with affection the ill-proportioned little Place des Hommes, not at all monumental and given over to puddles and to shabby cafes. I recall with tenderness the tortuous and featureless streets, which looked like the streets of a village, and were paved with villainous little sharp stones, making all exercise penitential. Consecrated by association is even a tiresome walk that I took the evening I arrived, with the purpose of obtaining a view of the Rhone. I had been to Arles before, years ago, and it seemed to me that I remembered finding on the banks of the stream some sort of picture. I think that on the evening of which I speak there was a watery moon, which it seemed to me would light up the past as well as the present. But I found no picture, and I scarcely found the Rhone at all. I lost my way, and there was not a creature in the streets to whom I could appeal. Nothing could be more provincial than the situation of Arles at 10 o'clock at night. At last I arrived at a kind of embankment where I could see the great mud-coloured stream slipping along in the soundless darkness. It had come on to rain, I know not what had happened to the moon, and the whole place was anything but gay. It was not what I had looked for. What I had looked for was in the irrecoverable past. I groped my way back to the inn over the infernal cailloux, feeling like a discomfited Dogberry. I remember now that this hotel was the one, whichever that may be, which has the fragment of a Gallo-Roman portico inserted into one of its angles. I had chosen it for the sake of this exceptional ornament. It was damp and dark, and the floors felt gritty to the feet. It was an establishment at which the dreadful gras double might have appeared at the table d'hôte as it had done at Narbonne. Nevertheless, I was glad to get back to it, and nevertheless, too, and this is the moral of my simple anecdote, my pointless little walk, I don't speak of the pavement, suffuses itself, as I look back upon it, with a romantic tone. And in relation to the inn, I suppose I had better mention that I am well aware of the inconsistency of a person who dislikes the modern caravansary and yet grumbles when he finds a hotel of the superannuated sort. One ought to choose, it would seem, and make the best of either alternative. The two old taverns at Arles are quite unimproved, such as they must have been in the infancy of the modern world when Stendhal passed that way, and the lumbering diligence deposited him in the Place des Hommes, such in every detail they are today. Vieilles auberges de France, one ought to enjoy their gritty floors and greasy window panes. Let it be put on record, therefore, that I have been, I won't say less comfortable, but at least less happy at better inns. To be really historic, I should have mentioned that before going to look for the Rhone, I had spent part of the evening on the opposite side of the little place, and that I indulged in this recreation for two definite reasons. One of these was that I had an opportunity of conversing at a café with an attractive young Englishman whom I had met in the afternoon at Tarascon, and more remotely in other years in London. The other was that there sat enthroned behind the counter a splendid mature Arlésienne, whom my companion and I agreed that it was a rare privilege to contemplate. There is no rule of good manners or morals which makes it improper at a café to fix one's eyes upon the dame de comptoir. The lady is, in the nature of things, a part of your consommation. We were therefore free to admire without restriction the handsomest person I had ever seen give change for a 5-franc piece. She was a large, quiet woman, who would never see 40 again, of an intensely feminine type, yet wonderfully rich and robust, and full of certain physical nobleness. Though she was not really old, she was antique, and she was very grave, even a little sad. She had the dignity of a Roman empress, and she handled coppers as if they had been stamped with the head of Caesar. I have seen washerwomen in the Trastevere who were perhaps as handsome as she, but even the headdress of the Roman contadina contributes less to the dignity of the person born to wear it than the sweet and stately Arlesian cap, which sits at once aloft and on the back of the head, which is accompanied with a wide black bow covering a considerable part of the crown, and which, finally, accommodates itself indescribably well to the manner in which the tresses of the front are pushed behind the ears. This admirable dispenser of lumps of sugar had distracted me a little, for I am still not sufficiently historical. Before going to the café I had dined, and before dining I had found time to go and look at the arena. Then it was that I discovered that Arles has no general physiognomy, and, except the delightful little church of Saint Trophimus, no architecture, and that the rugosities of its sturdy lanes affect the feet like knife blades. It was not then, on the other hand, that I saw the arena best. The second day of my stay at Arles I devoted to a pilgrimage to the strange old hill town of Les Baux, the medieval Pompeii, of which I shall give myself the pleasure of speaking. The evening of that day, however, my friend and I returned in time for a late dinner, I wandered among the Roman ruins of the place by the light of a magnificent moon, and gathered an impression which has lost little of its silvery glow. The moon of the evening before had been aqueous and erratic, but if on the present occasion it was guilty of any irregularity, the worst it did was only to linger beyond its time in the heavens, in order to let us look at things comfortably. The effect was admirable. It brought back the impression of the way, in Rome itself, on evenings like that the moonshine rests upon broken shafts and slabs of antique pavement. As we sat in the theatre, looking at the 2 lone columns that survive part of the decoration of the back of the stage, and at the fragments of ruin around them, we might have been in the Roman Forum. The arena at Arles, with its great magnitude, is less complete than that of Nimes. It has suffered even more the assaults of time and of the children of time, and it has been less repaired. The seats are almost wholly wanting, but the external walls, minus the topmost tier of arches, are massively, ruggedly complete, and the vaulted corridors seem as solid as the day they were built. The whole thing is superbly vast, and as monumental, for place of light amusement, what is called in America a variety show, as it entered only into the Roman mind to make such establishments. The podium is much higher than at Nimes, and many of the great white slabs that faced it have been recovered and put into their places. The proconsular box has been more or less reconstructed, and the great converging passages of approach to it are still majestically distinct. So that as I sat there in the moon-charmed stillness, leaning my elbows on the battered parapet of the ring, it was not impossible to listen to the murmurs and shudders, the thick voice of the circus that died away 1,500 years ago. The theatre has a voice as well, but it lingers on the ear of time with a different music. The Roman theatre at Arles seemed to me one of the most charming and touching ruins I had ever beheld. I took a particular fancy to it. It is less than a skeleton. The arena may be called a skeleton, for it consists only of half a dozen bones. The traces of the row of columns which formed the scene, the permanent back scene, remain. 2 marble pillars. I just mentioned them, are upright, with a fragment of their entablature. Before them is the vacant space which was filled by the stage, with the line of the proscenium distinct, marked by a deep groove, impressed upon slabs of stone, which looks as if the bottom of a high screen had been intended to fit into it. The semicircle formed by the seats, half a cup, rises opposite. Some of the rows are distinctly marked. The floor, from the bottom of the stage, in the shape of an arc of which the chord is formed by the line of the orchestra, is covered by slabs of coloured marble, red, yellow, and green, which, though terribly battered and cracked today, give one an idea of the elegance of the interior. Everything shows that it was on a great scale: the large sweep of its enclosing walls, the massive corridors that passed behind the auditorium, and of which we can still perfectly take the measure. The way in which every seat commanded the stage is a lesson to the architects of our epoch, as also the immense size of the place is a proof of the extraordinary power of voice on the part of the Roman actors. It was after we had spent half an hour in the moonshine at the arena that we came on to this more ghostly and more exquisite ruin. The principal entrance was locked, but we effected an easy escalade, scaled a low parapet, and descended into the place behind filed scenes. It was as light as day, and the solitude was complete. The two slim columns, as we sat on the broken benches, stood there like a pair of silent actors. What I called touching just now was the thought that here the human voice, the utterance of a great language, had been supreme. The air was full of intonations and cadences, not of the echo of smashing blows, of riven armour, of howling victims and roaring beasts. The spot is, in short, one of the sweetest legacies of the ancient world, and there seems no profanation in the fact that by day it is open to the good people of Arles, who used to pass, by no means in great numbers, from one part of the town to the other. Treading the old marble floor, and brushing, if need be, the empty benches. This familiarity does not kill the place again. It makes it, on the contrary, live a little, makes the present and the past touch each other. Chapter 31. The third lion of Arles has nothing to do with the ancient world, but only with the old one. The church of St. Trophimus, whose wonderful Romanesque porch is the principal ornament of the principal place, a place otherwise distinguished by the presence of a slim and tapering obelisk in the middle, as well as by that of the Hôtel de Ville and the museum. The interesting church of St. Trophimus swears a little, as the French say, with the perpendicular character of Arles. It is very remarkable, but I would rather it were in another place. Arles is delightfully pagan, and St. Trophimus, with its apostolic sculptures, is rather a false note. These sculptures are equally remarkable for their primitive vigour and for the perfect preservation in which they have come down to us. The deep recess of a round arched porch of the 12th century is covered with quaint figures which have not lost a nose or a finger. An angular, Byzantine-looking Christ sits in its diamond-shaped frame at the summit of the arch, surrounded by little angels, by great apostles, by winged beasts, by 100 sacred symbols and grotesque ornaments. It is a dense embroidery of sculpture, black with time, but as uninjured as if it had been kept under glass. One good mark for the French Revolution. Of the interior of the church, which has a nave of the 12th century and a choir 300 years more recent, I chiefly remember the odd feature that the Romanesque aisles are so narrow that you literally, or almost, squeeze through them. You do so with some eagerness, for your natural purpose is to pass out to the cloister. This cloister, as distinguished and as perfect as the porch, has a great deal of charm. Its four sides, which are not of the same period, the earliest and best are of the 12th century, have an elaborate arcade surrounded on delicate pairs of columns, the capitals of which show an extraordinary variety of device and ornament. At the corners of the quadrangle these columns take the form of curious human figures. The whole thing is a gem of lightness and preservation, and is often cited for its beauty, but if it doesn't sound too profane, I prefer, especially at Arles, the ruins of the Roman theatre. The antique element is too precious to be mingled with anything less rare. This truth was very present to my mind during a ramble of a couple of hours that I took just before leaving the place, and the glowing beauty of the morning gave the last touch of the impression. I spent half an hour at the museum, then I took another look at the Roman theatre, after which I walked a little out of town to the Aliscamp, the old Elysian fields, the meagre remnants of the old pagan place of sepulture, which was afterwards used by the Christians, but has been for ages deserted, and now consists only of a melancholy avenue of cypresses lined with a succession of ancient sarcophagi, empty, mossy, and mutilated. An iron foundry, or some such horrible establishment which is conditioned upon tall chimneys and a noise of hammering and banging, has been established near at hand, but the cypresses shut it out well enough, and this small patch of Elysium is a very romantic corner. The door of the museum stands ajar, and a vigilant custodian, with the usual batch of photographs on his mind, peeps out at you disapprovingly while you linger opposite before the charming portal of St. Trophimus, which you may look at for nothing. When you succumb to the silent influence of his eye and go over to visit his collection, you find yourself in a desecrated church in which a variety of ancient objects, disinterred in Arlesian soil, have been arranged without any pomp. The best of these, I believe, were found in the ruins of the theatre. Some of the most curious of them are early Christian sarcophagi, exactly on the pagan model, but covered with rude yet vigorously wrought images of the apostles and with illustrations of scriptural history. Beauty of the highest kind, either of conception or of execution, is absent from most of the Roman fragments, which belong to the taste of a late period and provincial civilization. But a gulf divides them from the bristling little imagery of the Christian sarcophagi, in which, at the same time, one detects a vague emulation of the rich examples by which their authors were surrounded. There is a certain element of style in all the pagan things. There is not a hint of it in the early Christian relics, which, according to M. Joanne of the Guide, are to be found more fine sarcophagi than in any collection but that of St. John Lateran. In two or three of the Roman fragments there is a noticeable distinction, principally in a charming bust of a boy, quite perfect, with those salient eyes that one sees in certain antique busts, and to which the absence of vision in the marble mask gives a look, often very touching, as of a baffled effort to see. Also in the head of a woman, found in the ruins of the theatre, who, alas, has lost her nose, and whose noble, simple contour, barring this deficiency, recalls the great manner of the Venus of Milo. There are various rich architectural fragments which indicate that that edifice was a very splendid affair. This little museum at Arles, in short, is the most Roman thing I know of out of Rome. Chapter 33. I find that I declared one evening, in a little journal I was keeping at the time, that I was weary of writing. I was probably very sleepy, but that it was essential I should make some note of my visit to Les Baux. I must have gone to sleep as soon as I had recorded this necessity, for I searched my small diary in vain for any account of that enchanting spot. I have nothing but my memory to consult, a memory which is fairly good in regard to a general impression, but is terribly infirm in the matter of details and items. We knew in advance, my companion and I, that Les Baux was a pearl of picturesqueness, for had we not read as much in the handbook of Murray, who has the testimony of an English nobleman as to its attractions? We also knew that it lay some miles from Arles, on the crest of the Alpilles, the craggy little mountains which, as I stood on the breezy platform of Beaucaire, formed to my eye a charming, if somewhat remote, background to Tarascon. This assurance having been given us by the landlady of the inn at Arles, of whom we hired a rather lumbering conveyance. The weather was not promising, but it proved a good day for the medieval Pompeii, a grey, melancholy, moist, but rainless, or almost rainless day, with nothing in the sky to flout, as the poet says, the dejected and pulverized past. The drive itself was never absolutely flat, and yet is never really ambitious, and is full both of entertainment and repose. It is in constant undulation, and the bareness of the soil lends itself easily to outline and profile. When I say the bareness, I mean the absence of woods and hedges. It blooms with heath and scented shrubs and stunted olive, and the white rock shining through the scattered herbage has a brightness which answers to the brightness of the sky. Of course it needs the sunshine, for all southern countries look a little false under the ground glass of incipient bad weather. This was the case on the day of my pilgrimage to Les Baux. Nevertheless, I was as glad to keep going as I was to arrive, and as I went it seemed to me that true happiness would consist in wandering through such a land on foot on September afternoons, when one might stretch oneself on the warm ground in some shady hollow and listen to the hum of bees and the whistle of melancholy shepherds. For in Provence the shepherds whistle to their flocks. I saw 2 or 3 of them, in the course of this drive to Les Baux, meandering about, looking behind, and calling upon the sheep in this way to follow, which the sheep always did very promptly, with ovine unanimity. Nothing is more picturesque than to see a slow shepherd threading his way down one of the winding paths on a hillside, with his flock close behind him, necessarily expanded, yet keeping just as it heels, bending and twisting as it goes, and looking rather like the tail of a dingy comet. About 4 miles from Arles, as you drive northward towards the Alpilles, of which Alphonse Daudet has spoken so often, and, as he might say, so intimately, stand on a hill that overlooks the road the very considerable ruins of the Abbey of Montmajour, one of the innumerable remnants of a feudal and ecclesiastical, as well as an architectural past, that one encounters in the south of France. Remnants which, it must be confessed, tend to introduce a certain confusion and satiety into the passive mind of the tourist. Montmajour, however, is very impressive and interesting. The only trouble with it is that unless you have stopped and returned to Arles, you see it in memory over the head of Les Baux, which is a much more absorbing picture. A part of the mass of buildings, the monastery, dates only from the last century, and the stiff architecture of that period does not lend itself very gracefully to desolation. It looks too much as if it had been burned down the year before. The monastery was demolished during the Revolution, and it injures a little the effect of the very much more ancient fragments that are connected with it. The whole place is on a great scale. It was a rich and splendid abbey. The church, a vast basilica of the 11th century and of the noblest proportions, is virtually intact. I mean, as regards its essentials, for the details have completely vanished. The huge solid shell is full of expression. It looks as if it had been hollowed out by the sincerity of early faith, and it opens into a cloister as impressive as itself. Wherever one goes in France, one meets, looking backward a little, the spectre of the great Revolution, and one meets it always in the shape of the destruction of something beautiful and precious. To make us forgive it at all, how much it must also have destroyed that which was more hateful than itself! Beneath the church of Montmajour is a most extraordinary crypt, almost as big as the edifice above it, and making a complete subterranean temple, surrounded with a circular gallery, or deambulatory, which expands it in intervals into 5 square chapels. There are other things of which I have but a confused memory: a great fortified keep, a queer little primitive chapel, hollowed out of the rock beneath these later structures, and recommended to the visitor's attention as the confessional of Saint Trophimus, who shares with so many worthies the glory of being the first apostle of the Gauls. Then there is a strange small church of the dimmest antiquity, standing at a distance from the other buildings. I remember that after we had let ourselves down a good many steepish places to visit crypts and confessionals, we walked across a field to this archaic cruciform edifice, and went thence to a point further down the road, where our carriage was awaiting us. The Chapel of the Holy Cross, as it is called, is classed among the historic monuments of France, and I read in a queer, rambling, ill-written book which I picked up at Avignon, and in which the author, M. Louis de Limbel, has buried a great deal of curious information on the subject of Provence, under a style inspiring little confidence, that the délicieuse Chapelle de Sainte-Croix is a véritable bijou artistique. He speaks of a piece of lace and stone, which runs from one end of the building to the other, but of which I am obliged to confess that I have no recollection. I retain, however, a sufficiently clear impression of the little superannuated temple, with its 4 apses and its perceptible odour of antiquity, the odour of the 11th century. The ruins of Les Baux remain quite indistinguishable, even when you are directly beneath them, at the foot of the charming little Alpilles, which mass themselves with a kind of delicate ruggedness. Rocks and ruin have been so welded together by the confusions of time that as you approach it from behind, that is, from the direction of Arles, the place presents simply a general air of cragginess. Nothing can be prettier than the crags of Provence. They are beautifully modelled, as painters say, and they have a delightful silvery colour. The road winds round the foot of the hills on the top of which Les Baux is planted, and passes into another valley, from which the approach to the town is many degrees less precipitous, and may be comfortably made in a carriage. Of course, the deeply inquiring traveller will alight as promptly as possible, for the pleasure of climbing into this queerest of cities on foot is not the least part of the entertainment of going there. Then you appreciate its extraordinary position, its picturesqueness, its steepness, its desolation and decay. It hangs, that is, what remains of it, to the slanting summit of the mountain. Nothing would be more natural than for the whole place to roll down into the valley. A part of it has done so, for it is not unjust to suppose that in the process of decay the crumbled particles have sought the lower level, while the remainder still clings to its magnificent perch. If I called Les Baux a city, just above it was not that I was stretching a point in favour of the small spot which today contains but a few dozen inhabitants. The history of the place is as extraordinary as its situation. It was not only a city but a state, not only a state but an empire, and on the crest of its little mountain called itself sovereign of a territory, or at least of scattered towns and counties, with which its present aspect is grotesquely out of relation. The lords of Les Baux, in a word, were great feudal proprietors, and there was a time during which the island of Sardinia, to say nothing of places nearer home, such as Arles and Marseille, paid them homage. The chronicle of this old Provençal house has been written in a style somewhat unctuous and flowery by M. Jules Canonge. I purchased the little book, a modest pamphlet, at the establishment of the good sisters just beside the church, in one of the highest parts of Les Baux. The sisters have a school for the hardy little Beaucenques, whom I heard piping their lessons while I waited in the cold parloir for one of the ladies to come and speak to me. Nothing could have been more perfect than the manner of this excellent woman when she arrived, yet her small religious house seemed a very out-of-the-way corner of the world. It was spotlessly neat, and the rooms looked as if they had lately been papered and painted. In this respect, at the medieval Pompeii, they were rather a discord. They were, at any rate, the newest, freshest thing at Les Baux. I remember going round to the church after I had left the good sisters, and to a little quiet terrace which stands in front of it, ornamented with a few small trees and bordered with a wall, breast high, over which you look down steep hillsides, off into the air and all about the neighbouring country. I remember saying to myself that this little terrace was one of those felicitous nooks which the tourist of taste keeps in his mind as a picture. The church was small and brown and dark, with a certain rustic richness. All this, however, is no general description of Les Baux. I am unable to give any coherent account of the place, for the simple reason that it is a mere confusion of ruin. It has not been preserved in lava like Pompeii, and its streets and houses, its ramparts and castle, have become fragmentary, not through the sudden destruction, but through the gradual withdrawal of a population. It is not an extinguished, but a deserted city, more deserted far than even Carcassonne and Aigues Mortes, where I found so much entertainment in the grass-grown element. It is of very small extent, and even in the days of its greatness, when its lords entitled themselves Counts of Cephalonia and Neophantis, Kings of Arles and Vienne, Princes of Achaia, and Emperors of Constantinople, even at this flourishing period, when, as M. Jules Canonge remarks, they were able to depress the balance in which the fate of peoples and kings is weighed, the plucky little city contained at the most no more than 3,600 souls. Yet its lords, who, however, as I have said, were able to present a long list of subject towns, most of them, though a few are renowned, unknown to fame, were seneschals and captains general of Piedmont and Lombardy, grand admirals of the kingdom of Naples, and its ladies were sought in marriage by half the first princes in Europe. A considerable part of the little narrative of M. Canonge is taken up with the great alliances of the House of Beau, whose fortunes, matrimonial and other, he traces from the 11th century down to the 16th. The empty shells of a considerable number of old houses, many of which must have been superb, the lines of certain steep little streets, the foundations of a castle, and ever so many splendid views, are all that remains to-day of these great titles. To such a list I may add a dozen very polite and sympathetic people, who emerged from the interstices of the desultory little town to gaze at the two foreigners who had driven over from Arles, and whose horses were being baited at the modest inn. The resources of this establishment we did not venture otherwise to test, in spite of the seductive fact that the sign over the door was in the Provençal tongue. This little group included the baker, a rather melancholy young man in high boots and a cloak, with whom and his companions we had a great deal of conversation. The Beaux-Cinq of to-day struck me as a very mild and agreeable race, with a good deal of the natural amenity which, on occasions like this one, the traveller who is waiting for his horses to be put in or his dinner to be prepared observes in the charming people who lend themselves to conversation in the hill towns of Tuscany. The spot where our entertainers at Les Baux congregated was naturally the most inhabited portion of the town. As I say, there were at least a dozen human figures within sight. Presently we wandered away from them, scaled the higher places, seated ourselves among the ruins of the castle, and looked down from the cliff overhanging that portion of the road which I have mentioned as approaching Les Baux from behind. I was unable to trace the configuration of the castle as plainly as the writers who have described it in the guide books, and I am ashamed to say that I did not even perceive the three great figures of stone, the three Marys, as they are called, the two Marys of Scripture, with Martha, which constitute one of the curiosities of the place, and of which M. Jules Canonge speaks with almost hyperbolic admiration. A brisk shower, lasting some 10 minutes, led us to take refuge in a cavity of mysterious origin, where the melancholy baker presently discovered us, having had the bonne pensée of coming up for us with an umbrella which certainly belonged in former ages to one of the Stéphanettes or Bérengères commemorated by M. Canonge. His oven, I am afraid, was cold so long as our visit lasted. When the rain was over, we wandered down to the little disencumbered space before the inn, through a small labyrinth of obliterated things. They took the form of narrow, precipitous streets, bordered by empty houses, with gaping windows and absent doors, through which we had glimpses of sculptured chimney-pieces and fragments of stately arch and vault. Some of the houses are still inhabited, but most of them are open to the air and weather. Some of them have completely collapsed. Others present to the street a front which enables one to judge of the physiognomy of Les Baux in the days of its importance. This importance had pretty well passed away in the early part of the 16th century, when the place ceased to be an independent principality. It became, by bequest of one of its lords, Bernardin de Beau, a great captain of the time, part of the appanage of the kings of France, by whom it was placed under the protection of Arles, which had formerly occupied with regard to it a different position. I know not whether the Arlesians neglected their trust, but the extinction of the sturdy little stronghold is too complete not to have begun long ago. Its memories are buried under its ponderous stones. As we drove away from it in the gloaming, my friend and I agreed that the 2 or 3 hours we had spent there were among the happiest impressions of a pair of tourists very curious in the picturesque. We almost forgot that we were bound to regret that the shortened day left us no time to drive 5 miles further, above a pass in the little mountains. It had beckoned to us in the morning, when we came in sight of it almost irresistibly, to see the Roman arch and mausoleum of Saint Remy. To compass this larger excursion, including the visit to Les Baux, you must start from Arles very early in the morning, but I can imagine no more delightful day. End of section 12.